December 29th, 1943. 02:47 hours, 220 nautical miles northeast of Singapore. Captain Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge wing of the destroyer Shigura, his binoculars scanning the black water of the South China Sea. Behind him, stretched in two columns, 10 tankers carrying 65,000 tons of crude oil and refined fuel, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine making the perilous journey from the southern resource area to the home islands. The convoy designation was HI-74. The cargo was irreplaceable. The risk was absolute. Hara had been protecting convoys for 18 months now, and he understood with cold clarity what the textbooks at Etajima Naval Academy had never taught him. Japan was bleeding to death, not from battle losses, but from something far more insidious. Merchant ships disappearing into the Pacific's depths faster than the shipyards could replace them. Sonar contact bearing 270, range 4,000 meters. The report crackled through the voice tube. Professional and precise. Too precise. The young sonar operator's voice held that peculiar flatness that came from forcing calm over terror. Hara's hands tightened on the bridge railing. The metal was cold, slick with tropical humidity that never quite evaporated even in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, his officers waited for orders, their faces pale shadows in the dim red light of the combat lamps. "How many?" Hara asked, though he already suspected the answer. "3 distinct signatures, Captain. No, 4. They're surfacing. 4 American submarines." The mathematics were brutal and simple. Shigura carried 24 depth charges. The tankers were unarmed merchantmen, sitting ducks that could barely make 12 knots. Against 4 fleet submarines operating in coordinated wolfpack tactics, the convoy's survival probability approached 0. What Captain Hara didn't know, what Japanese naval intelligence had failed to comprehend despite mounting evidence, was that the submarines hunting his convoy had been waiting exactly here, at exactly this time, because American cryptanalysts in Hawaii had read every word of his routing orders before he had. The Japanese merchant code JN40 had been broken 18 months earlier. Every convoy route, every departure time, every escort disposition. The Americans knew it all before the ships left port. The first torpedo struck the lead tanker Kenyo Maru at 02:51 hours. Hara saw the explosion before he heard it. A pillar of orange fire that climbed perhaps 300 feet into the night sky, illuminating the entire convoy in hellish clarity. The tanker's back broke instantly. 50,000 barrels of crude oil erupted across the water, transforming the sea into a lake of fire. "All ahead flank! Prepare depth charge pattern!" Hara's orders came automatically, drilled by years of training. But even as Shigure heeled into her turn, accelerating toward the estimated submarine position, another torpedo track cut through the burning water. The second tanker, Omorosan Maru, never had a chance. 2 torpedo hits, both amidships, within 5 seconds of each other. The explosions merged into a single, thunderous detonation that Hara felt in his chest cavity. The tanker simply ceased to exist, replaced by a fireball that lit the ocean for miles. Through his binoculars, Hara caught a glimpse of something that violated every assumption Japanese doctrine had made about American submarine warfare. A conning tower, fully surfaced, barely 800 meters away. The submarine wasn't hiding in the depths, as Japanese anti-submarine warfare doctrine assumed. It was hunting on the surface, using its superior surface speed and deck guns like a surface raider. "Gun crews to action stations!" Hara shouted. "Target bearing!" The order died in his throat as he watched the submarine crash dive in less than 30 seconds. disappearing beneath the burning oil with impossible speed. Where there had been a steel conning tower, there was now only disturbed water and the reflection of fire. They're faster than us, Hara realized with the cold clarity of impending disaster. They can surface, attack, and dive again before we can bring guns to bear. And there are 4 of them. The next 10 minutes became a masterclass in coordinated destruction that would haunt Hara for the rest of his life. The American submarines, operating with precision that suggested radio communication or pre-planned timing, struck from 4 different angles simultaneously. Torpedoes crossed the convoy lanes in patterns that made evasion impossible. Kyokuho Maru, 2 hits, port side, broken half. Taiyo Maru, single hit in engine room, dead in the water, burning. Shinyo Maru, 3 hits in quick succession, disintegrated. Shigure raced through the chaos, launching depth charge patterns at sonar contacts that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Hara knew with sick certainty that he was wasting ordnance. The submarine contacts were too fleeting, too fast, operating at depths the Japanese had never anticipated. American fleet submarines could dive to 400 feet, far deeper than Japanese depth charges were set to detonate. "Captain!" His executive officer grabbed Hara's arm, pointing astern. "The Kenyo Maru survivors." Hara turned and immediately wished he hadn't. The first tanker struck was still afloat, barely, its stern section jutting from the burning sea at a 40-degree angle. Men were jumping from the deck, preferring drowning to burning. But the oil fire was spreading, a vast pool of flame that pursued the swimmers across the water. The screaming carried across the ocean, audible even over the roar of fires and the concussion of depth charges. Hara had heard men die before, in battle, from wounds, from drowning. This was different. This was industrial-scale slaughter, mechanized death delivered by weapons the victims never saw coming. "Captain, we cannot stop," the executive officer said quietly. "If we halt to pick up survivors." "I know." Hara's voice was hollow. The convoy escort doctrine was absolute. The mission was protecting the cargo that remained, not rescuing men from ships already lost. To stop was to present a stationary target to submarines that had already proven their lethal efficiency. By 0315 hours, 38 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the attack was over. The submarines had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, melting back into the depths with the casual confidence of predators that owned the ocean. Behind Shigure, 7 of the 10 tankers were gone, sunk, sinking, or burning wrecks abandoned to their fate. 3 tankers remained. 3 out of 10. The survivors had managed to reach the relative safety of the convoy's center, surrounded by the burning wreckage of their companions like survivors in the eye of a hurricane. Hara did the mathematics automatically, the calculations of defeat that had become his constant companion. 7 tankers lost meant approximately 45,000 tons of petroleum products at the bottom of the South China Sea. Enough fuel to operate the combined fleet for 3 weeks. Enough to fly 5,000 combat sorties. Enough to matter desperately to a nation that produced almost no oil of its own. And the convoy had barely left Singapore. They still had 2,000 miles to travel through waters where American submarines waited at every choke point, informed by decoded messages and guided by coastwatcher reports that the Japanese couldn't suppress. As dawn broke over the South China Sea, painting the burning oil slicks in shades of crimson and gold, Hara allowed himself to think the thought he had been suppressing for months. We cannot win this war. Not because our ships aren't brave or our tactics flawed, but because every drop of oil must travel 3,000 miles through water, controlled by an enemy we cannot see, cannot catch, and cannot kill. What Captain Hara didn't know, what Japanese naval intelligence would not fully comprehend until after the war, was that the 4 submarines that had destroyed his convoy were part of a systematic campaign of economic strangulation unprecedented in naval warfare. While Japan's admirals planned for decisive fleet actions and contested landings, American submarines were waging a different war entirely. They were sinking the merchant marine. In December 1943, the month of convoy HI-74's destruction, American submarines sank 280,000 tons of Japanese shipping. This was more tonnage than Japanese shipyards could construct in 3 months. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan had started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By the end of 1943, they had already lost 3 million tons, and the American submarine campaign was just reaching its peak efficiency. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood reviewed the patrol reports from USS Pampanito, USS Ceylon II, USS Redfish, and USS Flasher, the 4 submarines that had massacred convoy HI-74. His chief of staff noted the tonnage figures with satisfaction. 7 confirmed sinkings, Admiral. Approximately 45,000 tons of tanker capacity, and not a single submarine damaged. Lockwood studied the map of the Pacific, marked with colored pins representing submarine patrol areas. There were now over 100 American submarines operating in Japanese waters, each one capable of carrying 24 torpedoes, each one equipped with radar that could detect targets at night, each one guided to convoys by intelligence so precise it seemed like magic. "They still don't understand," Lockwood said quietly. "The Japanese are still fighting for control of islands while we're sinking their economy. They're training pilots while we're destroying their fuel supply. They're building battleships while we're killing their merchant fleet." He placed another pin shown on the map, marking the location of convoy HI-74's destruction. It joined hundreds of others, each pin representing a convoy attacked, a merchantman sunk, a tanker sent to the bottom. The underwater war for the Pacific was being fought in dark water and decoded messages, and the Japanese were losing catastrophically without fully realizing it. Every convoy that left Singapore or Manila or Truk faced a gauntlet of American submarines that grew more dense and more lethal with every passing month. Captain Hara, standing on Shigure's bridge as the sun rose on December 29, 1943, watched the 3 surviving tankers of his convoy limping northward. He wrote in his log, in characters careful and precise despite his exhaustion, "The Americans have made the ocean their killing ground. We escort ships that are already ghosts. The convoys leave port condemned. I do not know how we are to win this war when every voyage is suicide and every loss irreplaceable." 3 weeks later, Hara would escort another convoy. 8 merchantmen would leave port. 2 would reach Japan. This pattern would continue, month after month, until Japan's merchant marine was not defeated but annihilated, until the home islands were starving, until the factories fell silent for lack of raw materials, until the war machine ground to a halt, not from battle damage, but from economic starvation. The story of that strangulation, of how American submarines transformed from cautious hunters to ruthless killers, of how underwater technology and cryptographic intelligence combined to strangle an empire, would become one of the most devastating campaigns in naval history. And it began in dark water, with torpedoes fired by submarines the Japanese could neither see nor stop. The weapon that had destroyed Captain Hara's convoy in those dark December waters was born from desperation, refined through failure, and perfected through industrial determination that the Japanese High Command never anticipated. In June 1940, when France fell and Britain stood alone, the United States Navy possessed 51 submarines, most of them obsolete S-class boats from World War I. The newest fleet submarines, the Porpoise and Salmon classes, numbered fewer than 20. American submarine doctrine emphasized caution, defensive operations, and adherence to international law regarding merchant shipping. Attack procedures required surfacing to verify targets, providing warning, and allowing crews to abandon ship before sinking. The Japanese, observing American naval exercises throughout the 1930s, had drawn reasonable conclusions. American submarines were few in number, conservative in doctrine, and constrained by laws their captains would follow even in wartime. These conclusions would prove catastrophically wrong on every count. The transformation began not in Washington, but in the design offices of the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire. Andrew McKee, chief constructor at Portsmouth, had been designing submarines since 1916. He understood that the vast Pacific demanded something unprecedented. Submarines that could travel 10,000 miles on patrol, dive deep enough to evade Japanese depth charges, surface fast enough to escape destroyer pursuit, and carry enough torpedoes to conduct extended war patrols far from any base. The result was the Gato-class fleet submarine, first laid down in October 1940. At 311 feet long and displacing 1,525 tons surfaced, these boats dwarfed anything in the Japanese submarine fleet. More importantly, they could dive to 300 feet operationally, with emergency capability to 400 feet, depths at which Japanese depth charges, set for shallower Russian and Chinese coastal submarines, detonated harmlessly above. "We're not building submarines," McKee told his design team in early 1941. "We're building underwater cruisers that can operate independently for 90 days at a time. Everything else, every other Navy's submarine, is a coastal boat pretending to be ocean-going." The engine room housed 4 Fairbanks-Morse diesel engines producing 5,400 horsepower, giving the boats a surface speed of 21 knots, faster than many Japanese destroyer escorts. Submerged, electric motors provided 9 knots for short sprints, or 2 knots for nearly 48 hours of silent running. The fuel capacity of 116,000 gallons meant operational ranges that seemed impossible to Japanese planners, who calculated American submarine endurance based on their own boats' limitations. But the real revolution was in numbers. Between 1940 and 1945, American shipyards would construct 288 fleet submarines, Gato, Balao, and Tench classes. At peak production in 1943, submarines were being commissioned at a rate of 1 every 3 weeks. Electric Boat, Portsmouth, Mare Island, and Manitowoc shipyards operated around the clock, each building multiple boats simultaneously. Commander Eugene Fluckey, who would become one of the war's most decorated submarine captains, visited the Manitowoc Yard in Wisconsin in early 1943. Watched workers, many of them women who had never seen the ocean, assembling submarines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. "They're building them like cars," Fluckey reported to his squadron commander. "Assembly line methods, prefabricated sections, standardized parts. The Japanese think in terms of craftsmanship, each boat individually constructed. We're thinking in terms of mass production. One yard in Wisconsin, 1,000 miles from the sea, is building submarines that will be floated down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico." The submarines themselves were marvels of habitability compared to their Japanese counterparts. American boats carried air conditioning, distillation, plants producing fresh water for showers, electric galley equipment that could prepare hot meals, refrigeration for storing fresh provisions, and even ice cream makers. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized Spartan conditions building warrior spirit. American doctrine emphasized comfort, enabling maximum combat efficiency over extended patrols. Lieutenant Commander Mush Morton, assuming command of USS Wahoo in December 1942, explained the philosophy to his executive officer, Dick O'Kane. "We're going to be at sea for 60 to 70 days. The crew needs to be well-fed, well-rested, and able to fight at peak efficiency at any moment. That means hot food, clean clothes, entertainment, and enough space to maintain sanity. The Japanese may romanticize suffering. We industrialize comfort." The torpedo rooms forward and aft carried 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, each 20 feet long and weighing 3,000 pounds. At least that was the theory. In reality, the Mark 14 torpedo was a catastrophic failure that would hobble the submarine campaign for nearly 2 years. The Mark 14's problems were threefold. The magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder failed when hitting at perpendicular angles, and the torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than set. Submarine captains reported perfect attacks resulting in no damage, torpedoes passing harmlessly under targets, exploding prematurely, or striking without detonating. Admiral Lockwood, assuming command of the Pacific Submarine Force in early 1943, discovered that the Bureau of Ordnance had never live-fire tested the Mark 14 against actual ship targets. The weapon had been designed theoretically, tested against nets, and declared operational based on mathematical models. When submarine captains reported failures, BUORD blamed poor attack techniques rather than weapon design. Lockwood conducted his own tests. On June 24, 1943, he fired torpedoes at cliffs along the Hawaiian coast, recovering unexploded weapons to examine the firing mechanisms. The contact exploder crushed on impact rather than triggering detonation. On July 31st, after more testing, Lockwood ordered the magnetic exploder permanently deactivated fleet-wide. By September, modifications to the contact exploder finally produced reliable detonation. The fix transformed the submarine campaign overnight. Suddenly, perfectly executed attacks produced the expected results. Merchantmen struck by torpedoes actually sank instead of continuing onward with minimal damage. The Japanese, who had been noting decreasing American submarine effectiveness throughout early 1943, watched in horror as hit rates jumped from 20% to over 60% in the last quarter of the year. But the greatest American advantage was one the Japanese never fully appreciated, even after the war: Operation Magic and the breaking of Japanese naval codes. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25 operational code by mid-1942. By 1943, they were reading Japanese merchant marine routing instructions, convoy departure times, routes, compositions, and escort details, usually within hours of transmission. The submarine operations room at Pearl Harbor resembled a corporate office more than a military command post. Rochefort's intelligence summaries arrived via pneumatic tube. Operations officers plotted convoy routes on transparent overlays. Submarine positions were marked with magnetic tokens on a vast chart of the Pacific. The choreography was precise. Submarines were positioned along predicted convoy routes 3 to 5 days in advance. creating ambush lines the Japanese couldn't avoid because they were following their own orders. Captain Hara, had he known, would have understood immediately why his convoys were being intercepted with such uncanny precision. The Americans weren't lucky or omniscient. They were simply reading the mail. The submarine that had orchestrated the destruction of convoy HI-74, USS Pampanito, under Commander Paul Summers, had received detailed routing information 4 days before the attack. Summers knew the convoy's departure time from Singapore, its planned route through the South China Sea, its composition, its speed, and the name of the escort commander. He had positioned his boat, coordinating with 3 other submarines via radio, to create an interlocking patrol line the convoy would steam directly into. "It's not hunting," Summers told his officers during the pre-attack briefing. "It's harvesting. We know where they're going, when they'll be there, and what defenses they have. Our job is execution, not detection." The technology supporting this execution was equally impressive. American submarines carried SJ surface search radar, capable of detecting ships at 12 miles, even in complete darkness or heavy weather. SD air search radar warned of aircraft at 20 miles. Japanese destroyer escorts possessed no radar until late 1943, and even then, their sets were primitive compared to American equipment. At night, American submarines could detect, track, and attack convoys while remaining completely invisible to Japanese lookouts, straining their eyes in darkness. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese merchant sailors began calling submarine attacks ghost strikes, torpedoes appearing from empty ocean, launched by enemies that left no trace of their presence. The submarine crews themselves were products of America's educational system and industrial culture. The average American submarine sailor had completed high school, unusual in any navy of the era. Many had technical training or college education. They could read complex manuals, understand mechanical systems, and improvise solutions to equipment failures using knowledge rather than rote procedure. Torpedo Man Second Class Mike DeSalvio, serving aboard USS Harder, exemplified this technical competence. When the submarine's torpedo data computer malfunctioned during an attack run in January 1944, DeSalvio jury-rigged a manual backup using principles he'd learned in an electronics correspondence course. The attack succeeded, sinking a 7,000-ton transport. "They teach us to think," DeSalvio wrote to his family. "Not just follow orders, but understand why we're doing things and figure out better ways to do them. That's different from how most navies work." By late 1943, the pieces had aligned. Reliable torpedoes, sophisticated intelligence, advanced radar, mass-produced submarines, and highly trained crews. The American submarine force was no longer learning. It was executing a systematic campaign of economic destruction that would become, tonnage for tonnage, the most effective naval campaign in history. The Japanese response was tragically inadequate. Their anti-submarine warfare doctrine, developed in the 1920s and 1930s, assumed submarines were slow, short-ranged coastal raiders that operated submerged and attacked by day. Japanese destroyer tactics emphasized visual detection, active sonar, and shallow-depth charge patterns, all useless against submarines that attacked on the surface at night from beyond visual range, then crash-dived to 400 feet. More fundamentally, the Imperial Japanese Navy had never prioritized convoy escort. The fleet trained for decisive battle, the climactic confrontation that would annihilate the enemy in one glorious engagement. Protecting merchant ships was considered inglorious garrison duty, unsuitable for the elite combined fleet. Escort vessels were few, obsolete, and commanded by officers whose careers had stalled. Captain Hara was unusual among Japanese destroyer commanders. He actually understood convoy warfare and had studied British anti-submarine tactics from World War I. But he was one officer among thousands, and the institutional mindset couldn't be changed by individual competence. "We have no doctrine for this type of warfare," Hara wrote in his diary in January 1944. "Our sonar cannot detect submarines at the depths they operate. Our depth charges detonate too shallow. Our escorts are too few and too slow. And somehow, I don't understand how, the Americans always know where our convoys will be. It's as if they read our sailing orders before we do." He was closer to truth than he realized. By early 1944, American submarines were operating in coordinated wolf packs, sharing contact information via radio, coordinating attacks to overwhelm escorts, and employing tactics that the Japanese had never anticipated. The submarines USS Tunney, Sterlet, and Hake operated together in the Luzon Strait in January 1944, sinking 9 merchantmen in a single coordinated night attack. The escort destroyers, following outdated doctrine, never even detected the submarines. The industrial disparity was overwhelming. Japanese shipyards managed to construct 3.3 million tons of merchant shipping during the entire war. American submarines would sink 5.3 million tons, more than Japanese pre-war capacity plus wartime construction combined. And these submarines did it while losing only 52 boats out of 288 deployed, a survival rate of 82% despite operating in enemy-controlled waters thousands of miles from support. The mathematics were inexorable, and the Japanese High Command was beginning to realize it. Each convoy that left port faced better odds of being sunk than arriving. Each tanker lost represented fuel the home islands would never receive. Each transport destroyed carried resources that Japanese factories desperately needed. The war would be decided not in climactic surface battles, but in dark water, where torpedoes fired by submarines the Japanese couldn't detect were strangling an empire one merchantman at a time. The transformation of American submarine warfare from cautious patrol to ruthless execution found its perfect embodiment in USS Wahoo under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton, a man the crew would come to call Mush for his apparent fearlessness that bordered on recklessness. Morton assumed command of Wahoo in December 1942 at Pearl Harbor. The boat had completed 2 war patrols under its previous commander with minimal results. One confirmed sinking in 8 weeks of operations. Morton studied the patrol reports and made a decision that would revolutionize American submarine tactics. He would take the fight to the enemy rather than waiting for targets to appear. "We're going hunting," Morton told his officers during their first briefing. "Not fishing. Hunters go where the prey lives. We're heading to Wewak Harbor." His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, spread the charts across the wardroom table. Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea was a major Japanese staging base. Protected waters, constant ship traffic, and shores bristling with coastal defense guns. It was also considered suicide for a submarine to enter. "The water's shallow," O'Kane observed. 60 feet in most of the harbor. If we're detected, we can't dive deep enough to escape depth charges. Morton's grin was predatory. "That's exactly why they won't expect us. Nobody's crazy enough to take a fleet boat into a harbor that shallow. Which means their defenses will be looking outward, not inward." On January 24, 1943, Wahoo arrived off Wewak after 12 days of transit. Morton spent the daylight hours submerged just outside the harbor entrance, observing traffic patterns through the periscope. Japanese ships entered and departed with casual confidence, their crews visible on deck, some waving to shore installations. No one expected death to be lurking in the clear tropical water. "They're not even zigzagging," O'Kane noted from his position at the plotting table. "They think they're safe once they reach the harbor approaches." Morton watched a destroyer escort pass overhead at exactly 16:45 hours. He could see the rust streaks on the hull, count the depth charge racks on the stern, observe individual sailors smoking on the fantail. The destroyer never slowed, never activated sonar, simply proceeded into harbor at a steady 12 knots. "Gentlemen," Morton announced to the control room crew, "tonight we're going inside." At 2130 hours, under cover of tropical darkness, Wahoo surfaced 3 miles from the harbor entrance. The night was moonless, the sky overcast, perfect conditions for surface approach. Morton conned the boat from the bridge, 4 lookouts scanning the darkness with night-adapted vision. The approach took 90 minutes of nerve-shredding tension. Every sound seemed amplified. The diesel exhaust, the bow wave, even the breathing of the lookouts. Twice they crash-dived when aircraft engines were heard overhead. Each time Morton brought them back to the surface within minutes, refusing to lose position. At 2300 hours, Wahoo slipped through the harbor entrance at 6 knots, her conning tower barely visible above the calm water. The harbor opened before them like a target range. Anchored transports, destroyers tied to piers, supply ships loading cargo under floodlights that illuminated the entire basin. "Jesus Christ," breathed Torpedo Man Third Class Forrest Sterling from his position in the forward torpedo room. "There must be 20 ships in here." Morton studied the layout through binoculars, his tactical mind calculating angles, ranges, and escape routes. The harbor was roughly 3 miles across, roughly circular, with a narrow entrance channel they'd just traversed. Ships were anchored in groups, with the most valuable targets, large transports and a destroyer tender, positioned in the harbor's center. "We'll take the big transport first," Morton decided. "The one with the tall funnel. Range?" O'Kane, now stationed in the conning tower with a stopwatch and plotting board, calculated quickly. 2,000 yards, anchored, stationary target. Angle on the bow, 090, broadside to us. "Forward torpedo room, make ready tubes 1 through 4, Morton ordered down the voice tube. "Depth setting 8 feet. Spread for a stationary target at 2,000 yards. In the forward torpedo room, Sterling and his crew worked with practiced precision. Each Mark 14 torpedo weighed 3,000 pounds and required 4 men to load into the tubes. The weapons were armed, depth settings verified, firing solutions checked and double-checked. "Tubes 1 through 4 ready in all respects," Sterling reported. Morton took one final look through the periscope, confirming the target picture. The transport sat at anchor, fully loaded based on her waterline. Cargo booms still rigged, deck lights blazing. He could see crew members moving about on deck, completely unaware that a submarine had penetrated their supposedly secure harbor. "Fire 1. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air ejected the first torpedo. "Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 torpedoes, each carrying 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, tracked through the dark water at 46 knots. The time to target was 96 seconds, an eternity in combat. Morton kept his eyes glued to the periscope, counting seconds under his breath. The first torpedo struck the transport amidships, below the waterline, with a detonation that illuminated the entire harbor in orange-white flash. The second hit 5 seconds later, slightly aft. The third and fourth struck almost simultaneously at the stern. 4 hits, Morton announced calmly. Target is breaking apart. Con, come left to 270. Steer for that destroyer tender at the North Pier. The harbor erupted in chaos. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness, probing the water in random patterns. Alarm sirens wailed from shore installations. The stricken transport was already settling by the stern, its back broken, crew abandoning ship into water lit by spreading fuel oil fires. But Morton wasn't leaving. He was hunting. Range to destroyer tender? He called to O'Kane. 1,200 yards. She's tied to the pier, can't maneuver. Stern tubes. Make ready 5 and 6. The destroyer tender was a critical target, a ship designed to service and repair destroyers, carrying spare parts, machine shops, and technical personnel that the Japanese couldn't easily replace. She was also massive, displacing perhaps 10,000 tons, and currently helpless at pierside. Fire 5, Fire 6. Both torpedoes ran true, covering the short distance in less than a minute. The first struck the tender's stern, the explosion massive enough to blow the ship's propeller and rudder completely off. The second hit amidships, penetrating the engineering spaces. 2 hits on the tender, O'Kane reported. She's listing 15 degrees to port and sinking at the pier. Now the harbor defenses were responding in earnest. Shore batteries opened fire, their shells splashing into the water in random patterns as gunners tried to locate a target they couldn't see. A destroyer anchored near the harbor center was getting underway, black smoke pouring from her stacks as the crew desperately tried to build steam. Morton watched the destroyer through his periscope, calculating. The Japanese captain was doing exactly what doctrine required, heading directly for the last known torpedo launch point. But Morton had moved. Wahoo was now positioned between the destroyer and the harbor entrance, blocking the exit. He's coming right at us, Morton observed. Doesn't know we're here. Range? 800 yards and closing, O'Kane replied. Speed estimate 12 knots. Forward tubes. Make ready 1 and 2. We're going to shoot down his throat. Firing torpedoes bow on at an approaching destroyer violated every rule in the submarine manual. The target angle was terrible. Minimum profile, maximum chance of torpedo malfunction. And if the attack failed, the destroyer would be on top of them in less than 2 minutes with depth charges ready. Captain, O'Kane said carefully, if we miss, we're not going to miss. Fire 1. The torpedo leapt from the tube, tracking directly toward the oncoming destroyer. Morton didn't wait for impact. Fire 2, all ahead flank. Take her down. Make your depth 60 feet. Wahoo dove as the destroyer's lookouts finally spotted the conning tower. Machine gun fire rattled across the water where the submarine had been seconds earlier, but the torpedoes were already in the water, tracking true. The first torpedo struck the destroyer's bow, the explosion lifting the front third of the ship clear out of the water. The second hit directly in the forward magazine. The resulting detonation was catastrophic. The destroyer disappeared in a fireball that reached 500 feet into the air, the blast wave strong enough to rattle Wahoo's hull even at depth. Jesus, Sterling whispered in the forward torpedo room, feeling the concussion through the submarine's steel. We just blew up a destroyer. But there was no time for celebration. Wahoo was now in 60 feet of water, with her keel nearly touching the harbor bottom. Depth charges from shore installations were detonating overhead, not close enough to damage but near enough to be terrifying. The explosions produced hammer-like concussions that echoed through the boat, causing light bulbs to shatter and cork insulation to rain from the overhead. Morton ordered silent running. All non-essential machinery was shut down. The crew spoke in whispers. Wahoo crept toward the harbor entrance at 2 knots, using only the electric motors, every man listening to the sound of propellers overhead as patrol boats crisscrossed the harbor. The passage to the entrance took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Twice, patrol boats passed directly overhead, their propeller sounds deafening in the silent submarine. Each time, Morton held course and speed, refusing to give away their position by sudden maneuvering. At 145 hours, Wahoo slipped through the harbor entrance and into deeper water. Morton brought her to periscope depth, surveying the chaos they were leaving behind. 2 ships were sinking, one was already gone, and the harbor was lit by searchlights and burning vessels. Small craft darted about, searching for survivors and a submarine that was already disappearing into the darkness. "That, gentlemen," Morton announced to his crew over the intercom, "is how you conduct a war patrol. Now let's go find some more targets." Over the next 3 days, Wahoo conducted a rampage across the Bismarck Sea that would become legendary in submarine warfare. Operating primarily on the surface, using radar to detect targets at night, Morton turned his submarine into a surface raider that the Japanese couldn't counter. On January 26th, Wahoo intercepted a small convoy, 2 freighters and a single escort. Morton attacked on the surface at dawn, using the submarine's deck gun to sink both freighters after their crews abandoned ship. The escort, a small patrol craft, tried to ram Wahoo but was outmaneuvered and left behind. "We're faster than their escorts on the surface," Morton explained to his crew, "and with radar, we can see them before they see us. We're not submarines anymore. We're surface raiders that can dive when threatened." The next day brought the encounter that would define Morton's aggressive philosophy. Wahoo detected a large transport escorted by 2 destroyers. Standard doctrine called for submerged approach and cautious positioning. Morton instead ran ahead of the convoy on the surface at flank speed, positioning Wahoo directly in their path, then diving at the last moment to attack from ahead. The transport never had a chance. 3 torpedoes struck in quick succession, sinking her in less than 4 minutes. The destroyers, confused by the unexpected attack angle, dropped depth charges on the wrong side of the sinking transport, while Wahoo escaped in the opposite direction. By January 30th, when Wahoo departed the area to return to Pearl Harbor, she had sunk 9 ships totaling over 30,000 tons, more than most submarines achieved in their entire war careers. But beyond the statistics, Morton had demonstrated that aggressive surface tactics, combined with reliable torpedoes and radar, could transform submarines from cautious hunters into dominant predators. The patrol report Morton submitted caused immediate sensation at Pacific Fleet submarine headquarters. Admiral Lockwood called Morton to his office personally. "Commander, your tactics violate virtually every established submarine doctrine," Lockwood said, holding the patrol report. "You entered an enemy harbor on the surface at night. You engaged destroyers bow to bow. You spent more time surfaced than submerged. You used the deck gun against armed escorts." Morton met the Admiral's gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. And I sank 9 ships." Lockwood's stern expression broke into a smile. "Exactly. Which is why I'm showing this patrol report to every submarine commander in the Pacific. You've just written the new doctrine." Within weeks, Morton's tactics were being adopted fleet-wide. Submarines began operating more aggressively, attacking on the surface at night, pressing into defended waters, coordinating in wolf packs. The cautious, tentative American submarine campaign of 1942 transformed into the ruthless war of attrition that would strangle Japan. For the Japanese merchant marine, the implications were catastrophic. If American submarines could penetrate defended harbors, attack in coastal waters, and overwhelm escorts with aggressive surface tactics, then no convoy route was safe. The ocean had become a free-fire zone where American submarines owned the night. Captain Hara, reading intelligence reports about the WWII attack in February 1943, understood immediately what had changed. The Americans were no longer playing by the rules. They were hunting with confidence, attacking with precision, and disappearing before counterattacks could develop. "This changes everything," he told his executive officer. "If they can enter our own harbors and sink ships at anchor, how are we to protect convoys at sea? We've been training to defend against submarines that obey international law and attack cautiously. These Americans are pirates with radar and torpedoes." Mush Morton would complete 4 more war patrols in Wahoo, each one more aggressive than the last, sinking a total of 19 confirmed ships. On his 5th patrol in October 1943, Wahoo failed to return from operations in the Sea of Japan. Japanese records captured after the war showed she had been sunk by aircraft depth charges in La Perouse Strait. But Morton's legacy lived on in every submarine that adopted his tactics. The ghost of Wahoo's audacious Wewak patrol haunted Japanese convoys for the rest of the war, proof that American submarines could strike anywhere, at any time, and that no defensive measure was adequate against an enemy that combined technological superiority with aggressive tactical innovation. The underwater war had become total, and the Japanese merchant marine was swimming through a sea of predators. The audacity demonstrated by Mush Morton's Wewak raid spread through the American submarine force like wildfire. What had been a cautious, rule-bound campaign transformed into a systematic program of economic destruction that Japanese defenses proved utterly incapable of countering. By mid-1943, American submarine tactics had evolved into a deadly science. The submarines no longer hunted individually. They operated in coordinated wolf packs that shared radar contacts, divided targets, and overwhelmed escorts through simultaneous attacks from multiple bearings. Commander Roy Davenport, commanding USS Hake, pioneered the tactic of end-around attacks during a July 1943 patrol. Detecting a convoy at maximum radar range, 20 miles on a clear night, Davenport ran ahead of the convoy on the surface at maximum speed, positioning Hake directly in the convoy's path. When the Japanese ships arrived, they steamed directly into a firing solution that Davenport had calculated hours earlier. "It's not brilliant tactics," Davenport explained to his officers, after sinking 4 merchantmen in the attack. "It's simple mathematics. Our surface speed is 21 knots. Their convoys make 12 knots maximum. We can detect them at 20 miles. They can't detect us at all. We run around them, position ourselves where we want to be, and wait for them to arrive." The Japanese response to these tactics revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. Captain Nakao Katsuki, commanding an escort squadron based at Truk, attempted to counter American submarines using tactics developed against slower, shorter-ranged boats. His destroyers would sweep ahead of convoys using active sonar, attempting to detect submerged submarines in the convoy's path. But American submarines weren't in the convoy's path. They were behind it, tracking by radar, waiting for darkness to attack on the surface. Katsuki's destroyers swept empty ocean, while submarines trailed the convoy like wolves following a herd, selecting targets at leisure. In August 1943, convoy Mi-11 from Manila to Yokohama provided a textbook example of Japanese defensive inadequacy. The convoy consisted of 14 merchantmen, protected by 4 destroyer escorts under Katsuki's command. His battle plan called for 2 destroyers to sweep ahead, one to patrol each flank, maintaining a protective box around the convoy. USS Harder, under Commander Samuel Dealey, detected the convoy at 0130 hours using SJ radar. Dealey called in two nearby submarines, USS Pargo and USS Snook, creating an impromptu wolf pack. The three submarines coordinated their attacks via encrypted radio, dividing the convoy into sectors. At 0300 hours, all three submarines attacked simultaneously from different bearings. The Japanese escorts, detecting multiple torpedo wakes, had no unified response. Each destroyer pursued the nearest contact independently, leaving large sections of the convoy unprotected. In 15 minutes, 6 merchantmen were hit. 4 sank immediately. 2 more went down before dawn. Katsuki's after-action report, captured after the war, revealed his bewilderment. We detected submarine contacts at 3 different locations simultaneously. When we moved to engage one, torpedoes came from another direction. The enemy submarines appeared to be communicating and coordinating their attacks. Our doctrine has no counter to multiple simultaneous threats from different bearings. The evolution continued as American submarines pushed deeper into Japanese-controlled waters. The Sea of Japan, Japan's inner lake, surrounded by the home islands, Korea and Sakhalin, had been considered absolutely secure. Japanese ships operated there without escorts, running on schedule, lights burning at night. In June 1943, USS Wahoo under Mush Morton entered the Sea of Japan via La Perouse Strait, operated for 6 days, and sank 4 merchantmen before Japanese forces even realized a submarine was present. Morton's patrol report described it as shooting fish in a barrel, targets everywhere, no escorts, ships proceeding peacefully as if at peace. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant sailors was devastating. If submarines could reach the Sea of Japan itself, then nowhere was safe. Men who had joined the merchant marine expecting to serve on interior routes found themselves sailing through waters where American torpedoes could appear without warning. Seaman Haruki Yamamoto, serving aboard the transport Asama Maru, kept a diary that survived his ship's sinking in September 1943. His entries traced the evolution of fear. July 1st, we sail tomorrow for Manchuria. The captain says the Sea of Japan is safe. American submarines cannot reach here. July 15th, we heard that a ship was torpedoed near Tsugaru Strait. The crew says it's impossible. There are no American submarines in these waters. August 3rd, another sinking reported. The officers are nervous. We now run without lights at night. September 12th, today we saw a periscope. The captain ordered emergency turns. We escaped, but the freighter behind us was hit. We are not safe anywhere. September 20th, final entry. Torpedo hit at 0340 hours. Ship sinking fast. I am abandoning. Yamamoto survived, rescued by a Japanese patrol craft. His ship did not. The submarine that sank Asama Maru was USS Wahoo on her 5th and final patrol. Morton would not survive the war, but his aggressive penetration of Japan's inner defenses had shattered the illusion of safe waters. By late 1943, American submarines were employing tactics that seemed almost casual in their effectiveness. Commander Gene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, conducted a surface gun action against a Japanese convoy in October 1943 that resembled piracy more than submarine warfare. Detecting a small convoy of 3 freighters with a single patrol boat escort, Fluckey surfaced in broad daylight, ran ahead of the convoy at flank speed, and opened fire with Barb's 4-inch deck gun at 4,000 yards. The patrol boat tried to respond, but was outranged and outgunned. Fluckey's gun crew, trained to fire while the submarine pitched in heavy seas, scored repeated hits on two freighters, setting them ablaze. When the patrol boat closed range attempting to ram, Flucky simply dove, waited for the escort to pass overhead, then resurfaced astern and resumed shelling. The entire action lasted 2 hours. Both freighters were destroyed. The patrol boat, out of ammunition and low on fuel, could only radio for help that would arrive far too late. "We're not hiding anymore," Flucky reported to his squadron commander. "With reliable torpedoes, radar, and the 4-inch gun, we can engage surface targets on our terms. The Japanese escorts are outmatched in every category: speed, sensors, weapons, and tactics." The Japanese attempted to adapt. New escort vessels were commissioned, smaller, more numerous ships designed specifically for convoy protection. But production couldn't match losses. For every new escort commissioned, 2 were sunk by submarines, aircraft, or surface action. The escort force, never adequate, was shrinking while the convoy workload increased exponentially. Captain Toshio Abe, commander of the escort vessel Amatsukaze, wrote in his private log in December 1943, "We cannot be everywhere. The Americans attack at night when we cannot see them. They use radar we do not possess. They coordinate attacks from multiple submarines we cannot track. When we detect one and move to attack, another strikes from behind. Our depth charges are useless. They dive deeper than our weapons can reach. I am sending men to protect convoys that I know will be destroyed. It is murder, not warfare." The statistics bore out Abe's despair. In 1943, American submarines sank 1.5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. Japanese shipyards constructed 769,000 tons. The gap, nearly double the construction rate, was mathematically unsurvivable. Japan's merchant fleet was shrinking by 700,000 tons per year, and the rate was accelerating. The introduction of FM sonar, frequency-modulated sonar that could detect submarines at greater ranges and depths, came too late and in insufficient numbers. Only a handful of Japanese escorts received the equipment before war's end. Most continued operating with 1920s vintage sonar that couldn't detect submarines below 200 feet. Meanwhile, American submarines were receiving technological upgrades that further widened the gap. The SJ-1 radar, introduced in late 1943, could detect aircraft at 30 miles and ships at 15 miles with precision that allowed fire control solutions without visual contact. ST periscope radar allowed submerged submarines to detect aircraft and surface vessels. ECM, electronic countermeasures equipment, detected Japanese radar emissions, giving submarines warning when patrol aircraft approached. Commander Lawson Ramage, commanding USS Parche, demonstrated the cumulative advantage during a July 1944 convoy attack. Detecting the convoy by radar at night, Ramage ran ahead and dove to periscope depth. Using ST radar through the periscope, he tracked escorts' positions without exposing the periscope visually. When an optimal firing position developed, he fired 6 torpedoes from periscope depth at a range of 1,800 yards, a shot calculated entirely by radar without visual confirmation. 5 hits, 3 merchantmen sinking. The escorts never detected Parche's periscope or position. The attack was executed with technological precision that the Japanese couldn't comprehend because they didn't know the technology existed. By 1944, the Japanese merchant marine was in terminal collapse. Convoys that had once numbered 20 ships now averaged 6. Routes that had been weekly schedules became irregular, unpredictable attempts to move cargo while avoiding submarine concentrations. Priority cargoes, oil, bauxite, rubber, sat in warehouses at Singapore and Manila because the tankers and freighters to transport them had been sunk. The statistics became increasingly dire throughout 1944. In January, submarines sank 209,000 tons. In March, 279,000 tons. In July, 393,000 tons. By October 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than the rate at which they had been built before the war, when Japanese shipyards operated at peacetime capacity without resource constraints. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, now commanding USS Tang, after serving as executive officer under Mush Morton, demonstrated the ultimate evolution of American submarine warfare during his 5 war patrols in 1944. Tang employed tactics that combined everything learned since 1942: aggressive surface approaches, radar-guided night attacks, coordinated wolfpack operations, and fearless penetration of defended waters. On Tang's 3rd patrol in June 1944, O'Kane intercepted convoy Mota 03 in the East China Sea. The convoy numbered 12 merchantmen protected by 7 escorts, an unusually heavy defensive screen that should have made attack suicidal. O'Kane didn't hesitate. He positioned Tang ahead of the convoy using radar, dove to periscope depth, and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes that hit 4 different ships. As escorts converged, Tang went deep, 400 feet, far below the effective depth charge setting. The escorts pounded the water overhead while Tang crept away silently. 2 hours later, after the escorts had expended their depth charges, O'Kane surfaced, ran ahead of the convoy again, and repeated the attack. 3 more merchantmen hit. This time the escorts, now critically low on depth charges, could only watch as Tang disappeared into darkness. Over 5 patrols, O'Kane and Tang sank 24 ships totaling 93,824 tons, making Tang one of the most successful submarines of the war. The tactics O'Kane employed, aggressive, repeated attacks on the same convoy, were now standard throughout the American submarine force. The Japanese had no answer. Captain Hara, now commanding the destroyer Yahagi, escorted what remained of Japan's convoys through 1944 with growing hopelessness. His war diary, preserved in Japanese naval archives, chronicled the collapse. March 1944. We escort 6 ships. 2 are sunk. I cannot protect them. June 1944. 4 ships. 3 reach port. This is called success. September 1944. The tanker I escort carries the oil for the mobile fleet's next operation. If it is sunk, the fleet cannot sortie. The responsibility is unbearable. October 1944. The tanker was sunk. The fleet cannot move. We have lost the war. That last entry, written in October 1944, was prophetic. The Japanese Navy's fuel situation had become so critical that major fleet operations were impossible. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 would be the last major sortie, executed only by draining every remaining fuel reserve. By December 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to 2.8 million tons from a pre-war high of 6 million tons. The shipyards were producing 200,000 tons annually, 1/10 the sinking rate. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan would have no merchant fleet by mid-1945. The human cost was staggering. Of 122,000 Japanese merchant seamen who served during the war, 60,000 died, a casualty rate of nearly 50%, higher than any combat branch of the military. Ships would leave port with full crews knowing that statistically, half would never return. Men continued to serve not from courage but from having no choice. Conscription was absolute, and desertion meant death. American submarine crews, by contrast, suffered losses of 22%, painful but sustainable. Of 16,000 men who served in submarines, 3,500 died. Each loss was mourned, but each submarine lost was replaced by two more. Each crew trained for months before deployment. Each boat carried the latest technology. The disparity in every metric — training, technology, tactics, production, intelligence — created an outcome that was never in doubt once the campaign reached full efficiency in late 1943. The Japanese merchant marine wasn't defeated. It was systematically annihilated by an enemy that combined industrial might with tactical innovation and technological superiority. The ocean had become an abattoir, and the killing had only just begun to reach its peak. The industrial machine that supported the underwater war against Japan's merchant fleet operated on a scale that Japanese planners had never conceived possible. While Japanese shipyards struggled to replace losses, American production accelerated beyond any historical precedent. The Electric Boat Company's facility in Groton, Connecticut, expanded from 5,000 workers in 1940 to 13,000 by 1943. The assembly process resembled automobile manufacturing more than traditional shipbuilding. Submarines were constructed in prefabricated sections: bow, stern, engine room, control room, each section built simultaneously in different areas of the yard, then welded together with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. At peak production in 1943, Electric Boat was launching a completed submarine every 17 days. The Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, 1,000 miles from the ocean, was building submarines that were launched into Lake Michigan, navigated down the Mississippi River system to New Orleans, then delivered to Pearl Harbor via the Panama Canal. The logistical complexity of building submarines in the American heartland and delivering them to the Pacific would have seemed impossible to any pre-war planner. Yet it worked with efficiency that bordered on the mundane. Production delays were measured in days, not weeks. Quality control exceeded combat requirements. Submarines commissioned in 1944 were superior to those built in 1942, incorporating technological improvements identified through combat experience and implemented across the entire construction program within months. Commander Slade Cutter, taking command of USS Seahorse in 1943, marveled at the industrial system supporting his boat. Everything works. Every system is reliable. When something breaks, replacement parts arrive within days, regardless of where we are. The boat is more complex than anything built before the war, yet more dependable. This is industrial warfare. Machines so well made that they become utterly reliable tools. The torpedo production told an even more remarkable story. After the Mark 14's problems were finally resolved in mid-1943, production ramped to 15,000 torpedoes annually. Each weapon required 2,500 individual parts machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, employed 11,000 workers, more people than served in many Japanese destroyer squadrons. But torpedoes were merely ammunition. The real industrial miracle was the logistics network that kept submarines operating thousands of miles from their bases. Submarine tenders, mobile floating machine shops, could perform repairs that would have required dry dock in any previous war. USS Proteus, a submarine tender stationed at Midway, carried 400 tons of spare parts, employed 1,200 repair specialists, and could service 8 submarines simultaneously. Machinist's mate First Class Robert Bourgeois, serving aboard Proteus, described the operation. We rebuilt engines, rewired electrical systems, machined replacement parts on lathes that would be at home in any factory. Submarines would arrive with battle damage and depart 3 days later fully operational. We worked around the clock. The submarines never stopped hunting because we never stopped fixing them. The contrast with Japanese capabilities was total. Japanese submarines that sustained damage often remained out of service for months, waiting for parts that never arrived. Japanese submarine tenders lacked the machine tools to manufacture replacement components. When a Japanese submarine's main motor failed, the boat was often written off as unrepairable because the spare motors didn't exist. American submariners, by comparison, treated equipment failures as minor inconveniences. USS Harder suffered a hydraulic system failure during a war patrol in March 1944 that made diving dangerous. Commander Sam Dealey surfaced, rendezvoused with USS Pargo, and transferred replacement hydraulic pumps at sea. The repair was completed in 6 hours. Harder resumed her patrol and sank 2 destroyers before returning to base. This logistical superiority extended to the crews themselves. American submarine training programs graduated 1,000 qualified submariners monthly by 1944. Each man received 6 months of specialized training: diesel mechanics, electrical systems, torpedo maintenance, damage control, navigation. The training was so thorough that submarine crews could perform their duties with a competence that Japanese submariners, often sent to sea with minimal preparation, could never match. The intelligence advantage, meanwhile, had evolved into complete transparency of Japanese operations. By 1944, American cryptanalysts were reading not only convoy routing messages, but also fuel allocation reports, maintenance schedules, and personnel assignments. Admiral Lockwood's operations staff could predict Japanese merchant ship movements with such accuracy that submarines were sometimes positioned days in advance at locations where convoys hadn't even formed yet. Captain Hara, still escorting the shrinking remnants of Japan's merchant fleet, never understood how the Americans achieved such precision. In early 1945, he escorted a tanker convoy that deviated from its planned route by 50 miles due to weather, and was still intercepted by submarines that seemed to be waiting exactly where the convoy emerged from the storm. The explanation that American submarines were simply everywhere seemed the only logical answer. The truth, that America was reading Japan's mail, remained inconceivable. The final statistics of the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping told a story of annihilation unprecedented in naval warfare. American submarines sank 1,078 merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons, more tonnage than the entire Japanese merchant fleet possessed at war's start. Additionally, they sank 214 warships, including a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. This destruction was accomplished by 288 submarines over 4 years of operations. The return on investment was staggering. Each submarine cost approximately $6 million to construct and operate. Each merchantman sunk represented cargo worth multiples of that amount: oil that Japanese factories desperately needed, rice that Japanese civilians were starving for, bauxite that aircraft production required. The economic damage inflicted by the submarine campaign exceeded $10 billion in 1940s dollars, while the entire program cost less than $2 billion. More importantly, the sinking of the merchant fleet strangled Japan's war production. By early 1945, Japanese factories were operating at 30% capacity due to raw material shortages. Aircraft production, which had peaked at 28,000 units in 1944, collapsed to fewer than 8,000 in 1945. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies which had been 1.75 million tons in 1943, dropped to 200,000 tons in 1944 and effectively zero by 1945. The human dimension of this strangulation appeared in Japanese civilian diaries and captured documents. Rice rations in Tokyo were cut from 330 grams daily in 1944 to 200 grams by war's end, starvation level. Workers in war factories collapsed at their machines from malnutrition. Thousands died in the home islands not from bombing, but from hunger caused by ships that never arrived because they rested at the bottom of the Pacific. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of the Combined Fleet, wrote in his post-war interrogation, "The submarine campaign made everything impossible. We couldn't transport oil to operate the fleet. We couldn't bring raw materials for aircraft production. We couldn't move troops to defend threatened positions. The Americans didn't just sink our merchant fleet. They severed the arteries connecting our empire. We bled to death slowly, watching cargo we desperately needed sink before reaching us." Captain Tameichi Hara survived the war, one of few Japanese destroyer commanders to do so. In his 1961 memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, he reflected on the December 1943 convoy massacre that had opened this story. Standing on Shigure's bridge that morning, watching 7 tankers burning on the horizon, I understood what the Americans had done. They had transformed submarine warfare from individual hunting to industrial slaughter. Their submarines were mass-produced weapons operated by highly trained crews, guided by intelligence we couldn't counter, armed with technology we couldn't match. They turned the Pacific into a killing ground, where our merchant ships were prey, and their submarines were predators that owned the ocean. We Japanese prided ourselves on warrior spirit, on Bushido, on willingness to die for the emperor. But spirit cannot overcome material reality. The Americans produced 288 submarines. We sank 52, a loss rate they absorbed without hesitation because new boats and crews arrived faster than we could destroy them. Meanwhile, every merchant ship we lost was irreplaceable. Every tanker sunk meant aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. Every transport destroyed meant soldiers couldn't be moved to defend critical positions. The decisive battle we trained for never came. Instead, we were defeated by accountants in Washington calculating tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, by engineers in Connecticut building submarines like automobiles, by cryptanalysts in Hawaii reading our messages before our commanders did. We lost the war not in battle but in production tables and logistics spreadsheets that proved industrial capacity determines modern warfare more than courage or tactics. Hara paused in his narrative to describe his final convoy escort mission in March 1945. He was protecting 3 small freighters carrying the last rice shipment from Korea to the home islands. All 3 were sunk by USS Archerfish within sight of the Japanese coast. Hara rescued 47 survivors from freezing water. 230 men died, along with 8,000 tons of rice that would never feed Japanese civilians. "I stood on Shigure's deck," Hara wrote, "watching men freeze to death in water I couldn't warm, watching rice spill from ruptured holds and sink into the Pacific. And I knew we had lost everything. Not because we lacked courage. Every merchant sailor who went to sea in 1945 knew he was probably sailing to his death. We lost because we faced an enemy whose industrial might was so overwhelming that our courage became irrelevant. The American submarine campaign achieved what no surface fleet could have: complete economic strangulation of an island empire totally dependent on maritime trade. Japan's conquest of resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia became meaningless when the resources couldn't be transported home. The southern resource area, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma, remained tantalizingly close but utterly inaccessible. By August 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to 1.5 million tons, one-quarter its pre-war size, and most of those ships were damaged, outdated, or trapped in ports they couldn't leave for lack of fuel. The proud merchant marine that had carried Japan's pre-war trade across the Pacific had been annihilated, vessel by vessel, torpedo by torpedo, by submarines that the Japanese could neither see nor stop. The lessons resonated through post-war naval thinking worldwide. The submarine had evolved from a coastal raider to a strategic weapon capable of deciding wars through economic warfare. The combination of technological superiority, industrial production, cryptographic intelligence, and aggressive tactics had created a weapons system that could strangle maritime nations. But the human cost, 60,000 Japanese merchant seamen dead, 3,500 American submariners lost, remained a sobering reminder that industrial warfare, however efficient, was still warfare. Every statistic represented men who died in dark water, some instantly from torpedo explosions, others slowly from drowning or exposure, all casualties of a campaign that proved industrialized democracies could mobilize resources on scales that authoritarian empires couldn't match. The pencil had stopped trembling. The tankers had stopped burning. The convoys no longer sailed because there were no ships left to form them. Captain Hara, standing on the bridge of the destroyer Shigure in that December dawn of 1943, had witnessed the beginning of Japan's economic execution. He couldn't have known that the massacre of convoy HI-74 was not an isolated disaster, but the opening act of a systematic campaign that would sink an empire one merchantman at a time. The Americans had made the ocean their killing ground, and in that vast Pacific graveyard, scattered across 64 million square miles of water, rested 5.3 million tons of Japanese shipping. The empire's lifeblood drained away by submarines that rewrote the rules of warfare and proved that in modern conflict, industrial might trumps warrior spirit every time. If you've made it this far, it's because you appreciate military history told with depth and precision. This channel is dedicated to bringing World War II narratives based on extensive research of primary sources, soldier diaries, intelligence reports, post-war interviews, transformed into stories that capture both the facts and the humanity behind them. Subscribe to support this work of serious historical documentation. Each subscriber helps keep this type of content, long-form narratives, deeply researched, and told with the respect that history deserves, being produced.